Not doing it. So I have a really long presentation, so hopefully I can get through all of it. So please feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm going to be presenting largely from my book, but some things are not from my book. But the book is free for everyone, so I'm going to put it in the chat. You can also buy it, but it's open access. So if you click on download, it'll take you to a free download link, which is really exciting because I believe, like probably all of you, that knowledge should be accessible. Um, so I have a couple of different objectives. The first one is a healing objective. I don't believe theory is not inherently healing, but I find it healing when I put it into practice. For to quote Bell Hooks, in its production lies the hope of our liberation. I hope to review just a brief history of statistics, critical race theory, and other critical approaches before I get to QuantCrit, quantitative critical race theory, and then I hope you leave today with some promising practices to apply. But you can ask questions throughout, and hopefully there's time at the end too. So I just wanted to briefly start with a icebreaker. It's what words come to mind when you hear quantitative data. If you could just type in the chat what words come to mind. Numbers, numbers, symbols, p-values, bits and pieces. I've never heard that one before. Statistics, large data, marginalizing, powerful, story, objective, aggregation, measurable, countable, data sets, de-identifiable, viable. So all of these are what we usually hear. We don't usually hear data and social justice. It's not the first thing that we associate it with. And that's largely because the history of statistics is rooted and grounded in eugenics. And it's very important before any of my courses I teach or any of the talks I give to just recognize what we're working with. And statistics was used by eugenicists to prove the racial superiority of white people and state that Black people were inferior. And it's important to state that. And Francis Galton here, the eugenicist on the right, and then we have Fisher on the left, who is the father of the F test, really gave scientific backing to these racist attitudes and popularized the concept that spread that human abilities like intelligence should follow a normal distribution or a bell curve. And Francis Galton is the father of regression and correlation, which is what is taught in most, if not every single basic statistics and quantitative research course. So although eugenics fell out of favor after World War II, it was still used in 65 by Cattell, by Terman, and recently in 94 by Murray when he stated that the bell curve proved differences between white and Black populations and men and women that were genetic, that were not about systemic discrimination. So although these ideas are over 100 years old, we can still find them in some of our modern literature. So it's important to recognize that. And with that, this process of QuantCrit is a process of unlearning and relearning. And it's a process that I go through, still go through, have been going through, because most of us were trained through a traditional statistics perspective, which states that numbers, as many of you put in the chat, are objective, are neutral. And we are now trying to reapproach statistics, saying that statistics are not objective, are not neutral. So QuantCrit provides us with an approach on how to approach the idea that statistics and numbers are not neutral and that we can use them for justice. There's never going to be a perfect step-by-step approach, and there shouldn't be, but it could provide us with a framing approach. So I just want to call out that it's unsettling. So QuantCrit examines how numbers are used to disguise systemic racism in education and protect this racist status quo, which is white supremacy. Again, it provides us with a framework, and it rests on 5 tenets. Critical race theory doesn't have any agreed upon tenets. There's many tenets, and people use varying tenets. But the foundation of critical race theory is number one, the centrality of racism, that our society and our environment, our policies, our laws, our institutions have embedded racism, and that is central to how we experience the world. And I'm going to go through each of the tenets and practices that you can apply the tenets, and know that there is no this practice is to this tenet. They overlap because of the centrality of racism being in every single one of these tenets. Numbers are not neutral is the second tenet that I will go through. Categories are neither neutral nor given. Voice and insight, and social justice orientation. So how familiar are you with QuantCrit? So I'll just, if you could put in the chat, not at all, a bit, very familiar. So most people are on the not at all familiar, like a bit to not at all familiar versus leaning on the a bit to very familiar side. Always have to take a quantitative, I'm just kidding, a quantitative measure. So again, QuantCrit is about critical race theory, and that is at the center of it, which is why I just want to make sure we all understand what critical race theory is. And it emerged out of a legal framework in the 70s and 80s by Derek Bell to the left, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among many others that I have not put on the slide. But it is a concept that racial bias is inherent in our laws and policies, and that without particular individuals will replicate and legitimize these racial inequities. So QuantCrit takes these lessons and insights and applies them to quantitative material. So there is a difference, though, between QuantCrit and quantitative criticalism, although they sound very similar and are using words in just different positions. But critical theory comes from the Frankfurt School. Critical theory comes from Marxism, and it is the idea to seek to confront social and historical and ideological forces and structures that produce and sustain society. That's where crit quant comes from. So QuantCrit is specifically and foundationally thinking about race. Critical theory and crit quant doesn't have to be. So I created this Venn diagram to help illustrate that point. We have quantitative methods and we have critical theory, which can be about race, but doesn't have to be about race. It could be about social inequality. It could be about gender. It could be about other things. But QuantCrit is about racism. And about 20 years ago-ish, Stage used critical quantitative inquiry to start to challenge statistics and challenge quantitative material. And there was a special issue in 2007 that came out with 3 commitments to use data to represent educational processes and outcomes to reveal inequities. But you can see here that there's no mention of race specifically, to question the models, to conduct culturally relevant research. We can say that maybe they were talking about race in that, but they didn't say race. And there's just other frameworks that I want you to know about that consider race and are thinking about race. It's not just QuantCrit. I'm not going to go through these, but I just want to put them out there. Critical race mixed methods, justice-oriented racist validation, very much looking at validating assessments and validating surveys. Critical quantitative participatory framework, something I'm myself very interested in. And then there's broader frameworks that are not necessarily thinking about race, but data equity in general. And then there's been many people who have come before me, and I just want to acknowledge them. W.E.B. Du Bois has been thinking about this. over 130 years ago in 1898. He did a Black portrait of Black America. You could see it here at the center. And it was at the World Fair where he used GIS mapping by hand to visualize inequities of the Black population at that time. There was no QuantCrit, but he was using those ideas to illustrate data for justice. We have White Methods, White Logic, which was a seminal book in thinking about the logic that we use for research. And we have child trends and why am I being researched? Many more who have been thinking about this. And I just think it's important to recognize those who have been doing this work and are still doing this work. So the first tenet is, again, the centrality of racism, the tenet that resonates most with CRT, and it's that race is a social construction. And in the absence of not using a CRT perspective, we're going to remake existing racial inequalities. So the necessity of using this perspective. And a first practice that we could think about is to start with the acknowledgement that racism exists and is prevalent. Now, what does this look like in quantitative research? Well, we're asking questions in quantitative research. And the way we ask the questions and the measures and models that we may create are going to be different if we start with this assumption. Are the research questions and survey items, if we're using them, framed from an asset-based perspective? Are we changing the onus of the institution and focusing on the inputs rather than the outputs? So, for example, a traditional question might be that I might ask in my randomized controlled trial or in my quasi-experimental design, what is the impact of college access program on Black boys? Now, I might frame it as how effective is college access program XYZ in reducing barriers in high school to increase college enrollment for Black boys. So now I am flipping the question to put the onus on the college program to reduce the barriers versus the onus on the Black boys to make sure that they get into college. So potentially reframing this question might have us come up with different instruments, different interpretations of the findings, and different implications. Another example, if anybody would like to try, is are Black students less likely to persist in science majors in college? Would anybody like to try this one?
I'll take a guess. Again, I'm a scholar, so bear with me. What systemic barriers exist that make it more difficult for Black students to persist in science majors?
I think that's definitely one way. I put a lot of options. I think the ones you're talking about are probably the last question, like what resources or supports would be needed to rectify the historic under-resourcing of communities of color. Um, Wait, that's a different one. Oh, here it is. Sorry, here it is. Very similar. So how are STEM disciplines racialized? What is the composition of STEM faculty? How do they experience STEM? So looking at school climate surveys and how they're experiencing, and then what you were saying, Virginia, I think like what resources and supports would need to invest to account for the historical exclusion of marginalized people in STEM. So thinking more about what are we inputting versus saying, well, are they succeeding less in putting that onus on the student? Another practice that I really believe in is defining race and racism. So race and racism are different. Um, Race is usually, not always, but usually it's a self-identification variable that we get in quantitative data. And racism is different in the sense that racism is the experience of these social institutions and policies that impact the way outcomes happen to populations of color and populations that are oppressed. So we have to avoid treating them the same. This happens a lot when people say, "Oh, I controlled for race in my regression." That doesn't mean that you controlled for racism. They are different things. And if you want to measure racism, then you need a variable and a measure of racism. You're measuring their self-identity that they have given to you. Or maybe it was a teacher or the parent that self-identified the student, but you are not measuring racism. And before the election, I would say avoid race evasive terms like diversity because I felt that they were DEI light. And I'm like, if you want to talk about race, then you have to say race. I will put this now with the caveat that things have changed, and I'm not exactly sure if I think that we should still be doing this. I think I can still do this in my work, and I will still do this, but I understand that other people can't necessarily do that. But if we want to measure racism and that's what you want to control in your regression, then you need to figure out what kind of racism are you talking about? Are you talking about interpersonal racism where somebody treats you, a particular individual treats you in a racist way? Are we talking about institutional racism? You have to be explicit on what kind. And there are measures that exist that I'm not saying are perfect, and I am not endorsing any of them, but they are a starting point where people have talked about how to measure this type of individual racism. And then there's more measures here on systemic and structural racism. So people have started thinking about how to study this. People have used GIS mapping and figuring out how particular redlining could have affected housing prices and figure out how to codify that into a measure of racism. So there are different ways to think about it if that is your goal of what you want to measure. Polos and colleagues use a couple of different data measures that they mesh together to call structural school level racism. So there's different ways of doing it. We want to avoid white-centric models, variables, and analyses. And what does this mean? Um, it means when we talk about reference group, who has ever used a white reference group? Uh, I can say that I have used, and I'll share the slides later. I'm watching the chat. I have said that I have used white reference group. This is how I was trained. I don't think anybody explicitly ever told me to use white reference group. It's usually the lowest category, like it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1 is the one that is omitted and used as a reference group because it's the lowest, and that's just what happens in quantitative research. So I have used it without thinking and just because like that is how I was taught. If anybody else wants to share, I'm not trying to say got you. I just want us to be vulnerable in the space of some of the practices that we have unintentionally just de facto um, done. Thank you, Virginia, for admitting that you have also. So I want us to think about avoiding, oh, and that's what you were told to do. Okay. I don't know if I was necessarily told, but if I see it in every single paper, I I am told unconsciously and subconsciously that that's what you're supposed to do. So if we keep using white as our anchor, we are normalizing whiteness. We are centering whiteness. We are making whiteness a status quo, and everybody else is othering. Now, sometimes it makes sense to do a reference group that is a white individual. For example, here, Lopez and colleagues said, we used white high-income women as our reference group because we're talking about educational attainment. And white high-income women have the highest attainment of any other social locations we investigate. So if you are being purposeful and intentional and it makes sense, that's one thing. But using it as a de facto is something that we need to really think about why we're using it. Another reason why I've really started to question why I've been using it is if we were to close the achievement gap today, students still could not read proficiently. The achievement gap between white and Black students and Latino and white students. Students still couldn't read proficiently on average. Students still couldn't do math on average. Students probably still don't have a livable wage if they were to close the wage between white and Black individuals. So even if we were to anchor on white, we still wouldn't be, I believe, where we think we should be as a society who can thrive, who can have health care, who doesn't have to think about rent. So I'm working on this paper right now and thinking about how you should choose your reference group. So if you are studying racial and ethnic disparities, maybe you shouldn't avoid. So you would go to the right, yes. Maybe you shouldn't avoid um, a white comparison group. You should start to think about, does it make sense to think about inputs or outputs? Am I going to be intentional and explicit about my reference group? Yes, you can still do those things. If you do want to avoid a white reference group, then you want to think about, maybe you want to think about within group variation. Maybe a reference group doesn't make sense. And within the Latino population, there would be a lot of inequities. Within the Asian community, there would be a lot of inequities. Within the Black community, there are a lot of inequities. Maybe you just need to look at those. Or going, maybe you want to compare to a grand average. Maybe that makes the most sense. And you can do this in a regression model. You can compare to the grand mean in a regression model. You don't need to have a reference group. It's a fact coding. Or you can take out white individuals if you think that there's too many white individuals in your sample, and that means you're automatically centering whiteness because there's just so many white individuals in your sample, and that's not what your research question is focused on. You can use a universal mean, and what I mean by that is something that you believe that all students should read, let's say 80%, and that's what you want to reference. You want to reference this artificial 80% that you've created. Or maybe you want to use an a priori or theoretical reference. So maybe you believe that, for example, in this case, we have Asian students, and we're looking at the differences within Asian students. And actually, Black students have the highest math achievement, let's just say. So maybe you want to compare them because you know prior research says that Black students have the highest achievement. So we're going to compare it to Black students. It doesn't always necessarily have to be this a priori of white students. There could be a theoretical or previous research that tells you that maybe you should be comparing them that way. The next slide just shows John and Fries's guidance, and these are sociologists. I'm not sure if I pronounced their name right, but it's Joffrey and Fries. And their guidance, which I think is good guidance, however, it is not, oh, how do I delete that? There we go. It is not critical. It's not thinking about race. It's just thinking about considering your reference group, which is also important. Not every study needs to be about race, but if you're going to do a QuantCrit study, it has to be about race. That is the center of it. But they have their own guidance. And I am building off of this guidance to do one that is thinking about race-focused guidance on reference group. And many times people will tell me, well, I have these really small samples and I can't use them. Like I can't look within groups or I can't even use them at all. And part of the book also talks about to think about other methods that exist already that were not necessarily created to be critical or to be focused on race, but we can use them for justice. So we can use non-parametric methods that don't rely on having large samples that can be used with small samples of 20, of 30. Of course, there's privacy reasons. And if you have 3 students, then we're not going to do any statistical tests, but we can use non-parametric methods when we're thinking about these things. The next tenet is that numbers are not neutral because they're gathered in ways that reflect interests and assumptions and perceptions of elites. Usually they are gathered reflecting elites and not reflecting people on the ground. So as I've been talking this entire time, it's thinking about outputs versus inputs. And what that looks like is when you're thinking about, for example, disciplinary rates, rather than say, well, what's a disciplinary rate by Black and Brown for Black and Brown children compared to Latinos, compared to Asian students? What is it? Think about the inputs. Think about what are the class sizes that these students are experiencing. What are the support staff ratios? How do the teachers reflect the race, ethnicity, and background of the students? How many school resource officers are there? What is the survey school climate data telling you about their experiences in school? So it's again about asking different questions, even though we're thinking about similar concepts that might lead us to new conclusions. Another one is thinking about Latinx college completion rather than thinking about the output, which is college completion, or the output, which is suspensions. What's the funding? What's the retention and transfer data? What type of institution is it? Is it a Hispanic serving institution? What kind of financial aid are they receiving? And what is the representation of staff and administration and faculty? And again, I've been saying avoid the use of white-centric variables in analysis. And what this can also mean is that when we're creating a model, it is explaining the variation of the variables that you put in the model. But these variables were selected by you. They were not selected by an AI model, or maybe they are in the new society, but usually we select the variables and then we run a model. So thinking about whether communities would agree with those variables that you are putting in the model, whether you want to ask them and whether you want to weigh their experience and their expertise as much as that of prior literature. And something that's a little bit contested also is thinking about using socioeconomic status, SES, or prior achievement in models. I was again taught to always put these in. Automatically compare to white, automatically if you have SES, put it in, prior achievement, put it in. These variables absorb a large amount of the variation, and the variation left is usually very small. If you control for them, then in some ways you control away racism because students experienced SES and prior achievement was not in a void of racism. They went to schools that were less resourced, that had fewer experienced teachers, that had lower expectations for them. And all of those factors that are related to racism are contributing to their current achievement. So prior achievement didn't occur without racism going into that variable. So I always recommend people to always do it in both ways. And economists particularly love doing lots of different types of models. So do your bivariate regression without SES or prior achievement. And then to make your journal reviewers and your dissertation advisor happy, do it the multivariate regression. But you're able to say a couple of those. You're able to say something different both ways. And I see that for Virginia, she was always told to. And I always wondered, I started questioning everything after I graduated and then unlearning and trying to relearn things. And related to this group, particularly, is merging data and pre-registering your studies. This is not in the book, but this is something that I added for this group because I think it is particularly relevant. No single data source will ever provide us with a full, accurate measure of multidimensional outcomes like poverty, like SES, like well-being, academic success, or racism. But if we open our data sets and are able to merge them together, then we can start to get measures and data for very vulnerable populations. Clinton-Lisell in 2022 merged a bunch of survey, tax records, federal and state data to look at the homelessness population. This is a very vulnerable population that is very difficult to get data for. And they were able to see that 53% of sheltered homeless under 65 had formal earnings of like $2,000 and 89% received government benefits. But they were only able to do this because they were able to merge all these data sets. And then pre-registering your study. And this doesn't sound like something that's critical, but I think that it can be because many people, when they find no interesting findings, that's when they start to disaggregate their data by race. And they do a bunch of data mining and p-hacking. So it encourages researchers to be intentional and upfront about whether they're focusing on racial and ethnic inequities from the beginning, or was this just an afterthought because you needed to get something published? So it allows people to really be transparent. The next tenet is that categories are neither natural nor given. They're arbitrary, they're embedded in our past practices and bias, and they change as we as a society change. There's no objective correct set of categories. Too few or too many can mask or illuminate inequalities. So again, categories are not fixed. The US Census has changed since 1790, the first census, when slaves were counted as three-fifths of an individual. And it was until 1860 that they were counted as a full person. Latinos, Hispanic, were counted until 1980. Before that, they were counted as white, sometimes as Mexican, and different variations. But the way we count people affects us in this country on how we do resource and funding allocation. And the way we count people can affect the different extent that racial inequity is portrayed. So choosing categories is really political and is really important in order to ensure that people are getting the resources they need. After George Floyd, student racial ethnic identities were actually shifting a lot. Many multiracial students started to identify as people of color. So these are not constant. They're not fixed. They also change within people, and they change within society. If we didn't have any racism in this country, then I don't think we would need to collect race data because people have told me, well, why are we collecting this? Isn't this like another way that it divides us, etc.? Well, because racism exists, we do need to collect it, and we don't have anything better right now. But here's an example of just different categories that are disaggregated by Asian country of birth. And Asian population is often stereotyped as a monolith. We have post-secondary enrollment rates, and we can see that there's a big difference between East Asian, Southeast Asian, and South Asian populations. There's very vulnerable populations in Southeast Asia that still need help with college enrollment. The Hmong, the Laotian, the Thai, the Burmese populations are falling behind very much the East Asian populations. Here in the left, we have white British and British Black and minority ethnic students, access to elite UK universities. But if you live in the UK, you know you need to disaggregate Black and minority ethnic. And when you do, you see that Black Caribbean students are severely underrepresented and Indian British students are overrepresented. And there is this inequity. But rather than reading race is related, this is how, again, I was also taught race is related to access to elite UK universities. Think about writing in your work. Racist patterns of inequality are associated with racial ethnic origin because it is not that people are born Black Caribbean and automatically don't have access to UK universities. It is the racist patterns of inequality in access, graduation, and achievement that have led to this inequality. And I encourage people to collect more granular, nuanced data, but I'm never going to be able to tell you which categories because you are the experts of your communities. But I do encourage multiple markers. So think carefully about the reasons that you're using categories in the first place and what categories might be more useful. Consider how individuals self-identify. a big thing in the Latino community right now is that Latinx, a lot of people and communities don't identify with Latinx. It is claimed to be an academic term. Latine is used. You might have seen me use it. I use everything interchangeably. I'm not sure if that's the best or right thing. I don't get offended, but I know others do. But Latine, maybe that doesn't resonate with people. So if I am to study a Latino population, I need to make sure that I know how they're identifying themselves. So when I ask participants, they're actually going to be able to give me a valid answer of their self-identity. It might make more sense to look also at intersecting systems of racism, like classism, colorism, heterosexism, ableism. So thinking about other things you may also want to collect. You want to avoid arbitrary categories. This is something that I've seen a lot in quant. It's racial reformation when you do white versus not white, or white, black, and everybody else. And if people did not identify as other, or if people did not identify as non-white, then when you recategorize that, you're racial reforming their identity, even because they never said that that's how they identified. So avoid using these arbitrary categories because it's easier for us. I like to do check all because people have multiple identities. And the next thing I want to ask you is be critical of the question measure you're using for race. Who actually put in the data? So I just wanted to ask you all, and you can answer in the chat, who inputs the race and data you receive? And this is a question that requires qualitative, in not qualitative in the formal big Q qualitative, but you asking people who's answering this questionnaire, how is it being input in the system? Does it go to the student that takes it to his parents? Does the teacher do it? Does the secretary at the front office make any final determination if you click too many that they weren't happy with? Do you have no idea how they were doing this? And it's just something to think about how they were doing it because in many places, the school staff is the final arbiter of race category. And there was a study that came out where if they chose Black and Latino, depending on whether the secretary thought they were more Black or more Latino, they would choose one of those because Florida required you to choose only one of those. So it's important to be thinking about those types of things because you never know who's actually getting the final say on people's identity. I do want to say that disaggregating data is the beginning of the work, not the end of the work. I've had people say, but I'm disaggregating, and Wendy said that that's QuantCrit. I'm like, no, that is like the bare minimum, and you need to start doing the work from there. Like whose needs are getting met? How do we make sure that systems and programs are accessible to people? How do we improve programs? So that's just the beginning of the conversation. And here are just some people who I think have done a good job at this. The right is AERA. The left is the University of California, collects data in this way. Both can be improved, but both are trying to do more than the 5 categories from the census, which are African American, Hispanic, American Native Indian, Asian, and white. Second to last tenet, I'm almost done, is that voice and insight cannot speak for itself. Data cannot speak for itself. Data needs advocates and analysts like you and me. And we want to contextualize the data because interpretations are what makes research research. Yeah. So it's not only important to think about the statistical significance, but what is the context and comparing it to other groups that are relevant for your population. In this example, if you say 70% of Latino college enrollees, how does that compare to the nation, the state? other students in the program and other students from other communities, giving just the data a lot more nuanced and understanding of what it means. You want to make meaning of the data and help the reader understand. Ground truthing your data, which actually comes from natural sciences, but it's the idea of speaking to community members through advisory groups, through data walks where you walk them through your data and having them make sense of the data. Did they agree with your sense of the data, the way it is being analyzed? Do these things resonate with them? Do they not resonate with them? So thinking about how to include community members. Something that is, I just want to point out that this person, Street et al., oops, they they had an indigenous group come and be part of their advisory committee because Australia requires you to have indigenous scholars in your advisory committee if you're doing work about indigenous people, which sounds like a really good idea. However, there are only few indigenous scholars. So the same indigenous scholars keep getting asked to be on the panel over and over and over again, and they're being overburdened. So we want to include community members, but we also want to be mindful of the fact that don't want to overburden them. We want to compensate them for their time, and we don't want to be exploitive. This person, Van Dusen, he was able to really look at effect size and put it in the context of centering the realities of systemic racism. And they use Gloria Ladson-Billingsley's framing of debts to society to say that rather than the effect size was, I believe it was 2, they said, society would have to provide opportunities equivalent of taking the course up to 2.5 times to repay the largest debt to society. So at the end of their paper, this is how they're interpreting the effect size. They're thinking about it in terms of debts to society versus just talking about a coefficient. Then there's data counter storytelling. As you may or may not know, but average is not a real person. Average doesn't exist. An average usually refers to majority group, which is usually white people. And it posits them that they're traditional, they're normal, and we want to aspire to that. So it's important to think about minoritized experiences and to not frame them as exceptions or deficits. So it's important to tell stories that counter the average, but that are not necessarily exceptions or deficits from the normal, but they can be also just as normal and aspirational. We can do this with data. We can use data visualization to bring out points so that data doesn't speak for itself. And this person used skin tones. They do not have sample sizes, which I was not happy about, but they use skin tones and they don't have a y-axis, which I was not happy about, but I liked their ability to think about bar charts in a new way. This person used women's faces and how her face changed in order to illustrate the point that they were trying to make, which I thought was just very innovative. And lastly, here's W.E.B. Du Bois, and there's the GitHub down below where people were able to use some of his data visualizations with modern data. But he was using data for justice with data visualizations here to show the number of slaves, to show the population of Black people, and to show the population of city versus rural Black people. And the last tenet, so hopefully there'll be time for questions, is social justice equity orientation. So I'm very upfront. I am not objective. I'm not trying to be objective. I have a social justice and equity orientation. So with this in mind, we just want to consider how we consume research and how we teach quantitative methods. Do we teach the racist history of statistics? Do we question researchers' use of language? do we think about research questions as we started the conversation? Are we interpreting our results with racism? And lastly, did the researcher, in this case myself, and in this case all of you, make an intentional effort to address their own biases, and state their assumptions and limitations clearly? Positionality, which is something that I feel like I've been a part of this movement of really pushing quantitative researchers to position themselves in the work, which is something that qualitative researchers have been doing forever. But now we're starting to see QuantCrit researchers really put forward the practice of putting a positionality statement where they reflect and address their position in society and their biases, where they get to explore their power. But for quantitative researchers, it's important that they don't just list their identities. I think that tends to happen sometimes with positionality statements, but think about their statistical training. My training was positivist and post-positivist. My training was at elite universities, and that's going to impact the way I see the world. And it's important for me to be upfront about that. The institutions I attended is going to affect the way that people perceive me. And I've also been doing a new practice where I do a positionality statement as a team. So when I work with a team, sometimes because of word limits or it just makes more sense, we think about how all of our positions are contributing to the piece, both positively and those that are thinking about their biases and assumptions that may affect the way they view the piece. I like to be really upfront about where I stand. I don't pretend to be somebody that I'm not. And then I hope that whoever reads my research can appreciate that and then take what I said with a grain of salt, whether they want to believe it or not believe it or have validity in it or not. But I was trained in experimental methods. I was not trained as a critical race theorist. I am new to critical race theory, and I look forward to applying it. I've also just stated that I've attended many Ivy Leagues. I used to teach at Princeton, and I understand the privileges that come with that. I very specifically state that I want to uplift the voices of community members. I do not intend to speak for the voiceless because I believe they have a voice, and I believe my job is to uplift their voice. I'm also very upfront about my street race. I believe it's mestiza, which is a mixture of indigenous and European roots. And I believe that in some spaces, some people might see me as white passing. So I recognize that bias. I also recognize that I am biased towards improving the lives of Black and Brown students. And it is a bias I am proud of and I don't wish to get rid of. And this is in my book, and it's a very long positionality statement, but you don't need a long one for an article because it's a book, it is longer. So I just wanted to ask you in the chat if you've ever seen one in a quantitative paper, not qualitative paper, in a quantitative paper. Interesting. I see a lot of no's. Guess since I've seen them, my bias of reading a lot of QuantCrit has led me to see a lot of them. Virginia has started to include hers. And then the last thing I'll say is just to go beyond overused measures. I know that we're given a lot of testing measures, because they're easy to get, at least they were. And it's just important for us to think about who created these metrics, which is likely white men and some white women, and to think about the fact that they were not centered on Black and Latino students. They were likely centered on white middle-class students. And do these racialized minority folks actually value these measures? So if they don't, then it's something we need to reconsider. And then I list here potential other metrics to use, like belonging, agency, critical consciousness. And I'll send you these slides, don't worry, but then I have examples of other measures people have created. And I want to end with just tensions. QuantCrit is not happening in statistics. So how do we incorporate it going forward? And how do we incorporate it for people who are already doing this work? And then there's just a lot of logical landmines. You make something more equitable for one group and it becomes less equitable for another group. And it's really difficult to do this work and figure out what makes the most sense and causes the least amount of harm. And lastly, a lot of our secondary data is just given to us and we cannot manipulate it, or not manipulate sounds bad. We cannot adapt it or make it work and retransform it because it was already given to us. So that sets up a whole other set of different challenges. We can do some of the stuff, but we cannot do all of it. So with that, I'll leave some time for questions. I have a couple few slides that I just wanted to make sure there was time.
I have a quick question. So you were talking a little bit about participatory action research and how that is, or at least my understanding was that sometimes that can also be incorporated in quantitative research. I've never heard of that, obviously because my bias as a qualitative researcher. Does that involve like using community members and all of that for like member checking? Is it like the entire research design process where community members are brought in? What does that actually look like from a quantitative perspective?
Think it looks the same as from a qualitative perspective. Like if you really want to do CBPR, community-based participatory research,
Sure.
then it has to be part of everything. I have a
Yes.
paper coming out. Hopefully that this month, next month, I can send you. I'm really interested in this work. I think this is the future of QuantCrit. Like, if you
Yeah.
really want to do QuantCrit, you have to include community. I
Yeah.
think you do. Maybe other people don't. Like, I can sit here and do it, but so I started and I did a review, interdisciplinary review of people in quantitative methods who have done this work. And that's coming out. And I'm not saying they're perfect, but public health has really done a good job at starting to look at quantitative
Mm,
participatory work. Some
okay.
people are doing it in every stage. Some people are only doing advisory and it's very like superficial. Some people have them as actual researchers in their study.
Okay.
And what I found was that when you did this, one of the findings was that it led to bigger impact because the community members they knew somebody in policy. Then they got a bill passed that increased nutritional programs in schools. That wouldn't have got passed if you didn't have them because you would have just done it. You would have got a good result. Hey, this leads to better nutrition, better outcomes, but because they were involved, they got this person and this person involved. So it's just a review because I want to be able to do that work to get me started, but I'll send it to you. It should be published it got accepted, so I'm just waiting for it.
Oh,
But it has been
good.
done. It's not perfect, but hopefully we can get there.
I would love to read that for sure. Thank you. It's very awesome. And by the way, if I had learned about QuantCrit or even Crit Quant as a grad student, I might have been a mixed method scholar because it's just
Me too, though. I didn't learn about it either until
yeah.
after I graduated.
Right. So it's pretty awesome. Thank you. This is very, very, very informative. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Other questions?
Uh, Hi, Wendy. Thank you so much for that presentation. Um, I kind of like, I don't know if there were any community norms for this, but given everything that's happening around us right now, how are you feeling about the future of QuantCrit? Um, Sorry, I figured someone.
Yeah, I I think that using that word can now lead to not getting any funding for your work. So I applied for a grant and I made it all participatory and I didn't use CRT because I was afraid of what that meant. I'm still gonna do it. I just didn't put it in the grant proposal. For me, I'm still gonna do all the work, but I'm in a very privileged position of that's why I went to faculty. And if I can't do this work, then I'm just gonna leave. Because I took a big, huge cut to become a faculty member. So I was like, I want to be able to do this work. And that's what you're supposed to be able to do in academia is do this work. So I think that for other people, there might have to be, you can still do the work without saying you're doing the work. And people have been doing this work since W.E.B. Du Bois. So people have been doing this work and during the civil rights movement, and they have been able to push back. I just think it is going to be harder to get some of this work funded than it was before. But I do think we still need to do the work, and maybe some people, because of where they sit, might need to call it something else. But we might, but we might all know in the space what we're talking about. I'm not really sure, but I think there are going to be just different. I used to say race, say it's about race, but now a year later, I'm like, well, if you're going to get fired and get $5 million taken away, then don't say race, but call it, Jasmine, it's about getting the American people's perspectives in my research. But like, I don't know what it might mean, but call it whatever makes sense, but still do the work.
Thank you.
Katie, do I know you from somewhere? I just feel like I do, and I can't remember.
Yeah, this is like my fourth Wendy talk.
Oh gosh, she's like tired of me.
Yeah, I've been to a few of your talks.
I was like, I know I've seen your name before.
I think we are connected on LinkedIn as well.
So one thing that one thing that might be helpful, as you think about mapping like the QuantCrit constructs to other vocabulary that is not likely to be censored, like if there is a way to share that information, because we have now several lists of censored words that are circulating, right? Like all of like from NSF, from other funding agencies and other reports.
I think so. I actually have a list that I came up with, but like, I don't know how to do it because if we share the list and they're going to put those words on their new list, if it becomes too widely shared, it's like, how do you do it so that that's the issue that I'm like coming up with. Like we have to keep it secret in some ways. Then some people were like, oh, well, maybe you should just misspell things. And I thought that was a good idea, but I'm not sure. Like you put two S's for inclusion or something like that. Um, because it will not come up on their search. So I'm not sure how to because we could come up with a list, but we don't want it to be reached to the wrong hands because then those get added. I used to think about person-centered work, but then that just got added.
Ugh.
Person-centered just got added. And then like Virginia said, words like female are added. I don't know how you that is.
I mean, uh, you read about people who study like plants and talk about needing like diverse
Diversity.
pollinators, and they lost their grant funding because the AI bots searching these are just flagging, without, I mean, not that any of these projects should have their funding removed,
Yes.
but there's no thought into it. Um, But it is tricky, like how do we do the work and communicate that we're doing important work, but that in a way that is navigating the realities that we unfortunately live in. Yeah, like do we develop a secret list? Like, only people who register for these. Yes, yeah, it really is, Katie. Only people who register for these kinds of talks and are vetted get the secret list of what we're calling DEI or QuantCrit or
But then someone's gonna leak it on a signal chat.
oh. then somebody gets added to the group chat that isn't supposed to be there. And
What is our official policy on inviting the editor of The Atlantic to our
he's more than welcome to come at any time. I'm a fan.
Is there an in-person meeting that, like, maybe some form of this can be
Mm.
visited where, we have some space to talk about? Maybe there's no artifacts that are circulating, but still we have the chance to.
I'll be at AERA in April.
Oh, me
Yeah, I
too.
was just gonna say we could have a secret session at AERA.
Yeah, maybe at a coffee shop even or somewhere.
A secure location underground.
Uh,
Yeah.
the bar at the Hotel Teatro is historic and beautiful and just off site.
Well, there you go. We can start passing lists around. So, I know we're at time. I just wanted to thank you again. Matching tattoos.
Only if you have the tattoo.
And you get the list. What was I gonna say? Sorry, I'm blanking. I got thrown off by the matching tattoos, and I just love that idea. Um, thank you so much for presenting. I can think of lots more questions to ask you, but I want to respect the fact that we're at time here. And just thank everyone to come here. Oh, Lacey, book clubs are a great place. Read a popular culture book, dissolve into talking about these issues. Oh, yeah. Okay. And thank you so much for joining us. So um, I think that is all. Wendy, if you just want to stay on the line quick, just so I can make sure to finalize everything for your those details. So okay. I just wanted, oh, let me stop recording.